Hello and welcome. Subscribe and help me hit 500 subs by January 1st. I am your grumpy guide to all things gaming, the OGGM. It is day 5 of RPG a Day 2020, and today's word is tribute. Tribute. This is not the best song in the world. This is not the best song in the world. This is not the best song in the world. It's just a tribute. A little Tenacious D for you to start the evening. It probably violated some copyright. So, tribute, reward, tribute band. Hey, a Motley Crue tribute band is playing at the Whiskey tonight. Tribute in recognition of. What does I think of when I think of tribute in regards to RPG? Well, a couple different things, but I thought I'd focus on the OSR movement, the old school Renaissance, the DIY OSR, OGL, whatever you want to call it, movement. Here's an example of an OSR game. This is one of the first OSR games that ever came out when the movement started, right around when the OGL became a thing. And I thought in our, 10-minute whatever time limit, I'd try and explain the OSR in as simplest terms as I could, using this Basic Fantasy Role-Playing 3rd Edition as an example of an OSR game and how the OGL can be used and why there are so many. I've lost count, but I'm pretty sure there's over 1,000 OSR retro clones, DIY hacks of the D20 fantasy system that we sort of recognize as the Dungeons and Dragons SRD, System Reference Document, that most, if not all of these hack or in some way or another. Now, some of the newer OSR games have gone off and sort of used their own system, but they still basically are sort of based on this idea. Now, this is $5. This was $5 plus shipping, and for this, you get a complete game, you get an entire player's handbook, you get an entire monster manual, and you get an entire dungeon master's guide for $5. The same three things would cost you like over $100 for 5th edition. So just think about this was $5. So in order to understand the OSR-ish thing, you got to understand that there's not just one edition of D&D or one just version of D&D. There's not just 5 versions of D&D, even though it says 5th edition. Even before 5th, there's like 20 versions of what we consider Dungeons and Dragons. And even post 5th, there's like 5 versions of Dungeons and Dragons going on. I don't know why this is going off so much. I'm sorry. I'll turn on the light. So we have 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons that came out 5 years ago. Player's Handbook, Monster Manual, DM's Guide. But then we have the 5th edition starter set. So that's 2. The 5th edition expert set. That's 3. The 5th edition Rick and Morty set. That's 4. The 5th edition Stranger Things set. That's 5. So that's 5 versions alone just from Wizards of the Coast that I can think of offhand that are Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. And using the same philosophy that the previous editions used, every permutation of the original book, the 5th edition Player's Handbook, the 5th edition SRD, can be considered a separate edition and can be something that people say, well, I like the version in the Rick and Morty rules, or I like the version in the Stranger Thing rules better than I like the rules in the Player's Handbook, so I'm going to hack those because the OGL lets me. And now this is not not even counting like independent 5th edition games like DM Dave's World of Ormuria, which is basically his take on 5th edition, which the OGL allows you to do. Now, as a tribute to Dungeons & Dragons, we have the Retro Clone OSR movement. And to understand the OSR Retro Clone movement, besides there's so many, is that there's not just 5 editions of D&D. There's like 20 editions of Dungeons & Dragons in those 5 editions because we have, going all the way back to day 1 in the original 3 books. And then we have the red box, we have the blue box, we have the basic set, we have the advanced set, we have the expert set, we have second edition, we have the basic set of second edition, we have the advanced set of second edition, we have all the permutations of second edition that came out, you have third edition, you have 3.5 edition, you have permutations of third edition that came out, you have fourth edition, and then you have other companies that did stuff based on fourth edition like True 20, and then you have fifth. So within all those permutations, like some people like Gygax's version, some people like Arnson's version, some people like Bloodhome's version, some people like Aronson's version, even though it's all still using the same basic D20 first edition, second edition, third edition, fourth edition, fifth edition, zero edition. But we have the red box, the blue box, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all those different permutations are considered separate entities. And, you know, this guy over here might really like this version of second edition, the, you know, expert sec or whatever, or the blue box or whatever, or the reprint that was in Japan. And the rules are just different enough for them to consider a separate entity from this version over here. And then they make a retro clone of that and call it, you know, Swords and Wizardry, or Tales from the Torchy Princess, or Three Candles in the whatever, or you call it this. So this is, you know, a permutation of this person's favorite version of the original rules. Now the original rules, you know, you only had the 4 races and the 4 classes. You had halfling, human, elf, dwarf, you know, and the 4 classes: fighter, cleric, wizard, thief. You had very limited spells, very limited magic items, very limited levels. You know, it's basically go in the dungeon, kill the monster, take his treasure, weird gothic horror and over-the-top 80s comic book and cartoon stuff. You know, humans could be every class, but the other 3 races were limited based upon stats. Halflings tended to be thieves, elves tended to be wizards, and dwarves tended to be fighters or fighter thieves. But the human could be every one of the 4 classes, and then, you know, whatever. There weren't prestige classes back then. There weren't, you know, archetypes back then. There weren't kits or skills or whatever. You just had the simple 6 stats, 4 races, 4 classes. And then this guy went back to his favorite version of the OGL, the original open game license, and said, this game system is based upon the D20 SRD Vision 3.5. So he took what he liked from 3rd edition. He took what he liked from the original 2 editions, for 0, 1st, and 2nd, THAC0 and everything like that, and he brought it up to modern day when this was first written about 5-6 years ago. So there you go. My tribute to understanding sort of very basically the OSR and why there are so many retroclone OSR hacks, because there's so many permutations of D&D. There's like 21 versions before 5th, and there's like 5 versions of 5th, and each one of them are slightly different enough that you could consider them technically as separate rules. I mean, 3 and 3.5 are technically separate and separate rules, and you could run a game using 3 and make permutations of 3, and you could run a game using 3.5 and make permutations of 3.5, which there are. You could do 2, 1, 0, red box, blue box, green box, basic set, advanced set, expert rules, immortal rules, whatever you want, Mystica. So all those are considered separate entities. Each one of those separate entities inspires a retroclone, an OSR. I have taken the basic ideas of the rules I like from this specific version, and the OGL allows me to republish it as long as I, you know, acknowledge that I'm using the OGL, and as long as I use some permutation of the D20 system and some permutation of the 6 stats. But again, some of the newer retroclones, like Mork Borg, aren't even doing that. But in general, there's that D&D feel, the idea of classes, the idea of races, the idea of that old school 4 races, 4 classes, limited levels, low power, you know, just that feel that first, second, third-ish had. That's 70s, 80s, early 90s D&D. So hopefully this tribute to the OSR movement has given you a general overview. Obviously, I can't explain all of it in every version and why this version is different than this version. Maybe I'll do that in another one, but this is a tribute, and I'm holding in my hand a tribute to Dungeons & Dragons in the OSR and the OGL with Basic Fantasy Role-Playing 3rd edition by Basic Fantasy, the old school, from our friends over at Chris Gonman and the Open OGL. So the OGL allowed him to write this. This is one of the very first OGL OSR games that came out. It came out in 2006, first edition. So yeah, there we go. So 20, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15, 14 years. So yeah, definitely one of the oldest, definitely one of the first OSR games. Hopefully you understand that. I will talk to you losers later. Subscribe. 500 subs by January 1st.